Hi, this is Amanda Mayer, and this is a case study for educational leadership when ethics and policies collide. All right, let's first look at the facts. Who all was involved? Mr. Inman is the assistant principal at Rocket Junior High. This is his first year there. James, who is the leader of a rough crowd of students. He's a student, and he kind of has a history of causing some trouble. David is an honor student. He is a standout trombonist, and he really doesn't have any history of trouble. James is fifth hour teacher who witnessed the exchange between James and David that caused that came into question. Then the school resource officer was called in, and then eventually the director of secondary education is involved and is telling Mr. Inman what he should do. Where did this take place? It was at Rocket Junior High, a school of about 900 students during the fifth period. What occurred? James's fifth period teacher witnessed James giving something to David in the hallway just after James was called to the office for his third tardy of the week. She thought that it could have been drugs, so she called the office and let them know. David was then called to the office along with James, and the school resource officer was called as well. Both boys were asked what had happened. David refused to say anything at first and was real nervous, but when was searched, was found that he had a pair of brass knuckles, which is a prohibited weapon, which the possession of which constituted a felony offense. James stated that they were his, and he told David that he would beat him up if David didn't hold the brass knuckles for him while he went to the office. Both boys were promptly arrested and taken to the youth detention center. According to the zero tolerance policy that the board has, both students should also be expelled for no less than 45 days into the district's disciplinary alternative education program. Mr. Inman filled out the paperwork for the alternative education program for James, but just couldn't do it for David because he felt that it was wrong to do so, even though that is what the school policy stated. Mr. Inman received a call from the director of secondary education, who then directed Mr. Inman to follow through with the expulsion papers for David. The director said that he would have to write an official reprimand for Mr. Inman, and which would be placed in his personnel file if Mr. Inman did not comply and write the expulsion papers. All right, let's look at any legal or ethical issues. Was there harm? Yes. James is placed in the alternative education program. He was making gains. Mr. Inman had been forming a relationship with him, and he was doing much better. Had been in less fights and less trouble. By placing him in this program, it could result in a decline in that, and so there is potential harm for James. David was arrested. His record could be permanently damaged. There was emotional damage that was done to him, emotional harm, as this was really not his fault, and not ever experiencing any of those things could definitely cause him some emotional harm. Mr. Inman could also be caused some harm, potentially, depending on if that report is put into his personnel file, and that will follow him then for the rest of his career as well. Was there a law that was broken? Yes. The possession of a weapon at school is a felony, so there was a law broken. Was there a contract that was breached? Possibly, depending on the wording of Mr. Inman's contract. If he doesn't comply with the directions of the director of secondary education, it could be in breach of contract. So when we synthesize this, we know that Mr. Inman's hasty response and lack of forethought brought about an unjust arrest of an innocent student and other negative consequences that now requires him to evaluate, communicate, and advocate for the correct ethical and legal decision. Let's go over the facts one more time. The people that were involved: Mr. Inman is the assistant principal. James and David were both students in the school. The school police officer was called in to help deal with the situation, and then the director of secondary education was also involved. This took place at Rocket Junior High, which is a junior high school, and then potentially will also be part of the disciplinary alternative education program that the district has if the boys were expelled. When we review and prioritize the information, we realize that there was some damage. The student suffers consequences of the arrest and then the suspension. There was emotional trauma, especially experienced by David. And then Mr. Inman's reputation could have some damage, potential damage as well, depending on his choice of what he chooses to do, whether to follow through with the expulsion or not. And then David's reputation. Obviously, he had not been in any trouble before, was an honor student, and this definitely damaged his reputation. Who are the stakeholders involved? The students, there's parents, the administration, the school, and ultimately the community. Can there be a decision made? Yes, I do believe that there's enough information to make a decision. There are some questions that would need to be addressed, such as, is there potential to add language to the school policy or to change the school policy? And then, what actions will best make reparation for the harm and the damage that was done by the actions? So now we can look at our options. Option 1 would be for Mr. Inman to take no action. He doesn't suspend David, and he ignores the request from the director of secondary education. Option 2 would be for Mr. Inman to go ahead and suspend David to follow the protocol and the policy. And option 3 would be, again, not to suspend David, to follow up with David's parents and with David, and then to address the policy for the future so that this doesn't happen again. Option 4 would be to go ahead and suspend David, but to then follow through and address the policy for future. When we evaluate our options, we can look a little bit at them. Option 1, which was to take no action, David is not harmed further. He's not suspended. Mr. Inman follows his personal ethics. He is feeling that it's not right for David to be suspended, so he's following his personal ethics. Mr. Inman is formally reprimanded, but the policy that is in place persists. Option 2, if Mr. Inman goes ahead and suspends David, he is not reprimanded, but David is harmed further, and Mr. Inman's personal moral ethics are violated. Option 3, if he does not suspend David, David is not harmed further. The policy is then addressed so that future instances like this do not occur. And then Mr. Inman does get a formal reprimanded fully, and that is placed in his file. Option 4 would be for him to suspend David. David is harmed. He has to go through that suspension. His reputation and his honor student status and all of those things would be harmed. But the policy would be addressed, changing the policy so that future things wouldn't happen like this. And Mr. Inman is not reprimanded. As we look at these choices, I think that the best option is option 3. By not suspending David, we prohibit further harm that is done to him. Already he has experienced some harm and some trauma, and we don't want to extend that. Mr. Inman would accept the reprimand, but he does get to follow his personal and ethics. And then the most important part would be that we were working to add language to the school policy to protect students like David in similar scenarios in the future. Why do I think that this is important? Students should be placed first, always. Mr. Inman's personal ethics are pushing him to act accordingly. He's using that moral compass, and that's important to develop that as a leader and to follow that when able. Zero tolerance policies have good intentions, but this scenario demonstrates the negative consequences. Each scenario is different and should be treated as such. David really did no harm in this, and he was not the one that caused the incident, so really shouldn't have been reprimanded. How could we implement this decision? Mr. Inman can formally accept the formal reprimand by not suspending David. That would be first. I think Mr. Inman then would need to schedule a meeting with David and his parents to address the incident and to let them know what had happened and why it happened and how in the future that is going to be changed and addressed, and to see what else that he can do to help make amends for the situation. Then Mr. Inman will work with the administration and the leaders to advocate for a change in the school policy so that something like this doesn't happen again. And then in the future, Mr. Inman needs to be more careful in calculating when he's calculating a response to similar scenarios. A lot of this could have been avoided if he would have handled the initial situation a little bit differently. But by calling in the resource officer right away, it caused, or knowing the policy, maybe being aware of the policy ahead of time, being able to do things a little bit differently so that he wasn't in the same situation in the future. It is important to remember that leaders need to understand and demonstrate the capacity to evaluate, communicate about, and advocate for the ethical and legal decisions by modeling ethical behavior in their personal conduct and relationships, and to cultivate ethical behavior in others. Building relationships with students and staff is key. Mr. Inman was doing that by building that relationship with those troubled students. Each situation is unique and needs to be handled correctly. There's always a unique set of circumstances that go into each incident, and they need to be handled as such. It's important to take a little time to ensure that the right steps are being taken before rushing into a decision. That's why it's important as a leader to develop that moral compass and to continually develop it and then use it and practice using it so that when situations arise, you know what the correct step would be. And then it's also very important to take time to reflect and evaluate the decisions that you have made and determine how you can improve. So once a decision has been made, taking that time to go back and reflect and see what you could have done differently and what could have been better. All of that is super important as a leader. Thank you, and have a great day.